Chapter 14, warm-up and flexibility training. So within this chapter, just pay attention to why a warm-up is important, the components of it, such as how long and what goes into it. But really with this, warm-up is important because it gets the body basically ready to go for training or competition. It gets the metabolic processes, gets the blood flowing, gets all this increased to get to the level of the intensity that you're going to be competing or training at. Okay, metabolic processes take time to get ramped up. Okay, blood flow takes a while to get the cardiovascular system going. So the warm-up is allowing the body to go from rest and then getting the body in a linear fashion up to the point where it needs to be for competition and or training. So with that, we'll just kind of talk briefly, just, make sure you know what goes into warm-up, how long. Shouldn't be too long because what happens is the more you do the warm-up, the more strenuous it is, the more it could take away from what you have for training and competition. So just know kind of the components, and then we get into then stretching. Okay, stretching can be part of a warm-up. Depends what you're doing. We always say do dynamic, not static. Static does decrease performance. Dynamic is a way to help get the body where it needs to get to be at. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about PNF stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. It's a type of stretching, so we'll go through the basics of that. So with this chapter, just know what a warm-up is, the components of it, what stretching is, and what the components of stretching are. Chapter 14, warm-up and flexibility training. Within this chapter, be able to identify the benefits and components of a pre-exercise warm-up, structure effective warm-ups, identify factors that affect flexibility, use flexibility exercises that take advantage of proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which you'll see coming up later in the chapter. We just say short-term PNF stretching, just the acronym, because proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation is hard to say sometimes. So we'll refer to it as PNF stretching. And then select and apply appropriate static and dynamic stretching methods. So with the warm-up, it is essential for pretty much every activity. Whether you're going for a training session or competition, it is important that you do get some kind of warm-up in, because it does help out with performance. You can see right here all the positive effects. Well, allows for a faster muscle contraction and relaxation of both the agonist and antagonist muscles, improvements in the rate of force development and reaction time, improvements in muscle strength and power, lower viscous resistance in muscles, increased blood flow to active muscles, enhanced metabolic reactions, and an increased psychological preparedness for performance. So you can see right here that with the warm-up, it affects and improves pretty much every aspect of performance. So it's essentially you get some kind of warm-up in, whether you're training, competition, whether you're performing an endurance event or you're doing a strength and power event. This is important that you get some kind of warm-up that gets you ready and gets you active and gets you set up for whatever it is the day is going to bring, whether training or competition. And you can see the structure of a warm-up influences potential improvements and needs to be specific to the activity to be performed. So meaning when you get to the warm-up, you need to really focus on what it is you're doing and have that warm-up structured around the activity for those improvements. So for instance, if you're a strength and power athlete, let's say you're an Olympic weightlifter, it's good to get some kind of endurance based warm-up in, maybe cycling for 5 minutes, or I wouldn't say running, nothing too much on the joints there, but a good cycle session for a few minutes is good for an Olympic weightlifter. But then once you get those few minutes of cycling in, then you get on the platform, you start warming up with a barbell. There's where your true warm-up comes for like Olympic weightlifters, on the platform with the barbell. Okay, if you're an endurance athlete, then you warm up doing the activity that you're doing. So if you're going for, a marathon or some kind of running based event, then you probably start off with the walk and then start, loosening up that way. And then you start building up an intensity to where you're actually running for the marathon. Okay, so structure your warm-ups based around what it is, the activity that you're doing. It's okay to get some kind of, like you see right here, to get some kind of aerobic based if you're an anaerobic athlete, but really needs to be specific. And so with this, they always say aerobic exercise is always a good way to incorporate into all warm-ups. Some kind of aerobic based exercise kind of gets the blood flowing and everything that we know of warm-ups. So make sure to incorporate that somehow, but based upon what you're doing will determine how long you're actually doing the aerobic exercise as a warm-up. Then it says here, then followed by some kind of stretching. Remember with that, we'll talk about it coming up a bit. It should be dynamic stretching, not static stretching. Static stretching is known to decrease performance. So you don't want to be doing any static stretching, but some kind of dynamic stretching. That is starting to go through different types of movements based upon what muscles are being used for the activity. So, walking lunges or, high knees, butt kicks, things like that. If you're doing, which most activities are lower body based activities. So those dynamic movements are good because they start to really incorporate those big muscles being used in the activity. And then once you're done with that, you says ending with a period of activity similar to upcoming activity. So if you're an Olympic weightlifter, do some kind of cycling, maybe for a few minutes to get warmed up. And then from there, do a dynamic warm up where you're getting and going through different, leg type movements like butt kicks, high knees, walking lunges, something like that. And then from there, you get on the platform and you start doing your barbell warm up and your movement there. Start going through the lifts that you'll be training or competing in that day. So the components, a general warm up period may consist of 5 to 10 minutes of slow activity such as jogging or skipping or cycling. And a specific warm up period incorporates movements similar to the movement of the athlete's sport. So, if you're like, I keep going back to Olympic weightlifter, I want to do 10 minutes of jogging. I wouldn't do jogging at all for that, but like 10 minutes of cycling, that might be a little long for Olympic weightlifter. Maybe 5 minutes might be better. I mean, you could do 10 minutes if you're, it's an early morning workout and it's hard to get going. But for certain athletes, spend more in the specific warm-up that is doing the movements that the athlete is going to be training that day. Because your overall warm-up just says, last between 10 and 20 minutes. Okay? If you do a really elaborate warm-up, that could take away from what is needed to get through the training session or the competition. So coaches will be able to know, and good coaches know exactly what their athletes can do and how they can warm up. And it takes time, but good coaches know exactly how to warm up without hindering the workout, the training session, or the competition. So as it says, an integral part of the training session says strength and conditioning professionals should plan warm-ups incorporating short, medium, and long-term considerations that will contribute to the overall development of the athlete. Okay, it's important to keep this in. Make sure you know when you're beginning the program consists of a warm-up throughout the entire duration of the training sessions. So we got the ramp protocol. So with the warm-up, this is kind of what the goal is. So 1 is raise. So that is elevate body temperature, heart rate, respiration, blood flow, joint fluid viscosity via low intensity activity to simulate the movement patterns of the upcoming activity. So here you get a lot of those metabolic processes are warmed up, getting them ramped up, keep going, getting heart rate, temperature, respiration, all these factors starting to, because you're going from rest to then you want to try and get to where the body can maintain the stress of an activity. So you want to slowly start elevating your body up to that point. So that's what raises, getting the metabolic processes and cardiovascular processes ramped up. Then you have activate and mobilize. So you actively move through the range of motion. So you get in here, once again, kind of going with the one, joints lubricated, getting them warmed up, getting them to be able to start going through the range of motion. And the last, potentiate. So perform specific activities that progress in intensity until the athlete is performing at the intensity required for the subsequent competition or training session. So here you just go, once again, all this is going from rest, and you're trying to get the body to the stress of whatever the activity is you're doing. So you're slowly building up on intensity, more and more and more and more, until the body can handle the intensity of the training session. So if you're going to come in and do like a heavy squat session, as far as an Olympic weightlifter, you're going to get on the platform, maybe do a couple, you'll do 5 or so with the unweighted bar, so no weight on the bar. And then you'll put on a certain amount of weight, do a set, certain amount of weight, do a set, more. You keep building up into whatever the training, where you're going to be training it for your squats. And usually you want to be training for squats roughly above 75% of your best single or best triple. Or whatever, if that's usually what most coaches are doing is for squats, 5, 3s, or 1s. So you want to be training at the higher intensity. And so you might do 3 or 4 squat warm-up sets, increasing weight each time until you get to that 75%. So that's what you're doing, is you're building the body up to handle that heavy stress of the workout or the competition. Next, we got flexibility. So this is a measure of a range of motion and has static and dynamic components. For the most part, the more flexible an athlete is going to be, a lot of time, the better they're going to be. Okay, you can handle through that range of motion, be able to handle the force and produce force and power through that greater range of motion. A lot of times flexibility does help with reducing injuries. So the more flexible you are, the more you could handle that deformation of a tissue to some extent. So flexibility is a thing that you should incorporate as an athlete. You should be flexible to some extent. Okay, you don't have to be, hyper flexible, but you should have a greater flexibility than the average person. Okay, you look at Olympic weightlifters, I use them as a good example. Incredible flexibility for as much strength as they're handling, because when you receive the bar in the clean or the snatch, you're put in a spot where you have to be, first you have to have that full range of motion, and then you're being put into a position that's highly mobile with weight either above your head or trying to catch it in the rack position for the clean. And so you need to be flexible and strong all at the same time. But nonetheless, you got to be flexible for that movement as well as pretty much any other athletic skill out there. And so we know with flexibility, there's static and dynamic. So static being the range of possible movement about a joint and the surrounding muscles during a passive movement. Dynamic is during active movements, so it requires voluntary muscle contraction actions. So static flexibility is just when the muscle's passive and you're trying to stretch it further than where it is at rest. Or dynamic is you're trying to move the muscle during an active contraction. It says acute effects of stretching or range of motion are transient. However, for longer lasting effects, a stretching program is required. You need to be 2 sessions per week for a minimum of 5 weeks. And the stretches should be held at a position of mild discomfort for 15 to 30 seconds. And that is primarily for static stretching there, because it's hard to hold a butt kick or a high knee for 30 seconds. But remember, for competition and training, static stretching should be done after those two, not before, because they will decrease performance. A lot of people ask me, like, well, what about gymnasts? What about fighters? They all do some kind of static stretching before an activity. And a lot of athletes do. Now, if you do a static stretch before an activity, just keep in mind that if long as you don't hold it to mild discomfort for a long period of time, it probably is not going to affect you. That's why fighters will do it, gymnasts will do it, because they're not really trying to increase range of motion there. They're just trying to, I guess, quote, loosen up a little bit. So if you're going to do static stretching before an activity, make sure you don't hold it for that long or to mild discomfort. That's the key point. There's where you increase the range of motions by holding it to mild discomfort for 30 seconds. So just remember that. That's why dynamics always done is preferred, because it's a quick movement and that's not changing that range of motion before an activity. Okay, so just remember, if you are going to do static stretching, just don't hold it for that long or to a point of mild discomfort. So here's all the factors that do affect flexibility. Okay, you got joint structure. So joints like the shoulder, hip, both ball and socket are going to have a different flexibility between the two of them because of the joint laxity. So the shoulder is going to have a greater range of motion than the hip. So therefore, it could go through different stretching than the degrees of stretching than the hip. Okay, then you got wrist. Wrist and is not as mobile as the shoulder, so you can only stretch that in so many ways. Okay, so the joint structure is going to determine how flexible it could be. You got age and sex. Older people tend to be less flexible than younger people. Also, females tend to be more flexible than males. You got muscle and connective tissue. Elasticity and plasticity of connective tissues affect range of motion. Okay, muscles are highly elastic, so when you stretch them, they could go back to their original shape. Connective tissues, a little bit different. Okay, ligaments, once those get stretched, well, they change completely and they don't really go back to their original shape. That's why if you've ever pulled a shoulder out of socket, you've probably done it more than one time because all those ligaments have been stretched out and they're not holding quite as tight. Stretch tolerance, so ability of an athlete to tolerate the discomfort of stretching. A lot of times you gotta be careful in here because some coaches yell at their athletes because they can't stretch and they complain because it might hurt a little bit much. Well, not everybody can handle pain the same way. So some people could handle the pain, so therefore you could get a greater stretch out of them than others. But it's up to the coach to kind of know their athletes and push the athlete to each athlete's individual level of discomfort. Because you're going to remember, to increase range of motion, it goes to a level of mild discomfort. You got neural control. So range of motion is controlled by the central and peripheral nervous system, both afferent and efferent mechanisms. This gets into your Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles. We'll talk about that coming up here in a bit, but that's what thought is reason why you can only stretch so much is because those neural factors, those reflex factors come into play. And so they think that if you silence some of those sensories to the spindles or the GTOs, then it allows the muscle to be stretched a little bit further. Resistance training, so it's exercise through a full range of motion and development of both agonist and antagonist muscles to prevent loss of range of motion. So make sure when you're training, you go full range. Okay, when you're squatting or do the Olympic lifts or anything like that, full range of motion will help increase the flexibility of the muscles. And so make sure that when you're training, you actually go through the full range because it will help out increase the range of motion. The muscle bulk, so large muscles may impede joint movement. Muscles are highly elastic and they are the ones that are able to go through the range of motion. They are able to stretch out because they're so elastic. And so it doesn't mean just because you have muscle, you're not going to be flexible. They're just saying those who have high amounts of muscle build could impede range of motion. So just kind of be careful on on that point right there, because everyone thinks like, well, if I get muscle increase, I'll get muscle bound and yada yada, and that's not necessarily true. Okay, muscles are what is the tissues that's allowing the joints to move through the range of motion, and so muscle are the ones that are stretching out and then coming back to normal resting length. Okay, and just because you put on muscle, that doesn't mean you're not going to be flexible. It's just it's the degree to what you put on could be. So if you put on tremendous amounts of mass, there might be some impeding of the joint movement. Maybe. An activity level. So an active person tends to be more flexible than an inactive one. But activity alone will not improve flexibility. And so that's why it's important to put in some kind of flexibility program, flexibility training within. That way you are making sure you're increasing range of motion and getting those benefits. So when should an athlete stretch? So following practice and competition. So post-practice stretching facilitates range of motion because of increased muscle temperature. It should be performed within 5 to 10 minutes after practice. And this may decrease muscle soreness, although the evidence on this is ambiguous. Also as a separate session. So if increased levels of flexibility are required, additional stretching sessions may be needed. In this case, stretching should be preceded by a thorough warm-up to allow for the increase in muscle temperature necessary for effective stretching. It says this session can be especially useful as a recovery session on the day after a competition. Okay, so what we're seeing right here is that we should be incorporating after competition. We're talking about the static stretching done after competition. Muscles are warmed up, and it will help facilitate range of motion. Not sure, like I said, if it really does decrease muscle soreness, but it is kind of a therapeutic that a lot of athletes like to do, especially after competition, to go through a stretching session, kind of help with recovery there. So it's not a bad thing to do. I mean, it's just because the evidence isn't really supportive doesn't mean, athletes do it for a reason, because they do feel like it helps out. So that's why it's a good thing to do. If an athlete feels like it helps out, allow them to do that. So I already kind of brought this up earlier, but with the GTOs and muscle spindles. So with flexibility, so we have the stretch reflex. So this occurs when muscle spindles, because remember, muscle spindles are determining muscle length, and they control muscle length. So they're stimulated during a rapid stretching movement. This should be avoided during stretching, as it will limit motion. So that's why when you're stretching, when you're doing a static stretch, you want to try and lengthen that muscle out in a slow, controlled fashion. That will help, because if you stretch the muscle really fast, those muscle spindles will notice that and they'll contract to get back to resting length. And so when you're stretching, make sure that you are stretching slow and controlled, because that will allow the muscle spindles to kind of gradually adjust to that length while you're doing that. And so as we stretch, what thought process is that they basically, over time, you start to silence these reflex a little bit, which allows the muscle to be stretched out to a longer point. So that's what the muscle lengthening out. Now, if you're dealing with some kind of tension built up in the muscle, you're looking at the GTOs. Because remember, the Golgi tendon organs or sensory or proprioceptors are located in the muscle tendon complex. And so with that, you have two processes. You got autogenic and reciprocal inhibition. So autogenic says is accomplished via active contraction before a passive stretch of the same muscle. So another reason why you want to stretch slow control, because what's happening is when you start to build tension up in the muscle, if tension gets too great, what autogenic inhibition is that you see the active contraction before passive stretch. So if you're building too much tension up in the muscle, then you're going to then have a reflex that send out to, let's say you're doing a bicep curl, and there's too much tension being built up in the biceps. Well, sensory will be sent, and then from there, you'll have a signal sent to the biceps to then relax. At the same time, as those biceps are relaxing, then you have the triceps contracting. And that's reciprocal inhibition. You can see right there, accomplished by contracting the muscle, opposing the muscle that is being passively stretched. And so, and you can see down there, it says both result for stimulation of the Golgi 10 organ, which cause reflexive muscle relaxation. And so what happens is as you're building up tension in one muscle, if it's too great, a sensory will be sent. And then from there, a reflex will be sent out to that muscle to then relax, causing the antagonist of that muscle to become the agonist, and then that be turned on to then contract. Such as a bicep curl coming up, then the bicep will relax, and then the triceps will contract. So nonetheless, one thing that thought process why we do increase our range of motion and flexibility is due to the silencing of these proprioceptors. That way we could push the body a little bit further past those points that then will cause then the muscle to lengthen out. So that's a neural component that they think that allows for us to increase that flexibility. So the three main types is static, ballistic, and dynamic. So static is slow and constant. So at the in position held for 15 to 30 seconds. And that's where you're pushing the body to that point of mild discomfort for the 15 to 30 seconds. Ballistic, so it involves active muscle effort. It uses a bouncing type movement in which the in position is not held. This should be avoided. Only really if you train, you can really know what you're doing. You can do some ballistic stretching, but it's the bouncing effect that could cause injury. So it's really recommended to stay away from those. That's why we usually employ static or dynamic. And dynamic, the last part down there, is that uses sport-specific movements to prepare the body for activity. Okay, and that's like I say, like common ones or high knees, butt kickers, walking lunges, things of that sort, or doing any kind of movement that's mimicking what the body will be doing during activity. So that's why we usually say static or dynamic is what we refer to. So for the static stretch, you get in the position that facilitates relaxation. So move the point in the range of motion where you experience a sensation of mild discomfort. If performing partner-assisted PNF stretching, communicate clearly with your partner. We'll get in that here in a sec on what that is. And then hold that stretch for 15 to 30 seconds. Repeat unilateral stretches on both sides. And usually you do a couple reps of that. So you might do 3 sets of holding. You might hold the stretch each muscle for 30 seconds 3 times, essentially. That's usually kind of the recommendation on the static stretch there. And dynamic, carry out 5 to 10 repetitions for each movement, either in place or over a given distance. You progressively increase the range of motion on each repetition. And increase the speed of motion on subsequent sets where appropriate. And actively control muscle action as you move through the range of motion. So this is, like I said, you might have a team out on the field and have them do high knees for 10 yards. That's kind of that 5 to 10 repetitions there. Or maybe a little bit longer, but still, get them go 10, 15 yards of a certain movement and telling them to try and do each movement through the greatest range of motion possible. And that would be considered what we refer to as a dynamic stretch. The key is in this one, make sure they're doing the full range of motion. That's putting that muscle through that full range. Okay, finish up with PNF stretching. And this is always usually done with a partner. And this is kind of a type of stretching that is putting the joint and the muscles to a fuller range of motion that can be accomplished alone. And so there's a couple types of PNF stretching. So the first one will be hold and relax. And we got pictures to show you what those are, but just there's 3 parts to all the PNF. For the hold and relax, though, first is you have a passive pre-stretch, isometric hold, and then a passive stretch for the certain amount of times right here. And so you'd go through this sequence right here, maybe a couple of times. You could do it once, or usually most athletes kind of go through a couple of times when doing it. So for instance, this would be stretching the hamstring right here. And then, of course, that's the starting position for the hamstring, the stretch. And so what would you have is you'd have a partner locked down. You can see how the leg on the ground is locked down, because you want to try and keep, for this one, the hips as stable as possible as you're stretching. Because once the hips start to move, then you're not engaging the hamstrings quite as much. So remember, when you're stretching, you want to try and keep the muscle and the joint that you're stretching as stabilized as possible. Okay, and so if the hips move too much, or the knee moves too much, I should say, on this one, then you're disengaging the hamstrings, not the hips moving. My bad on that. It's when you're doing the hamstring right here, the hamstrings do move the hips. But you can see this person is locking down the leg on the ground. That's keeping the hips as stable as possible. And you can see other hands on the knee. And that's keeping the hamstrings locked in so the quads don't come into play. Therefore, you can stretch the full range of motion of the hamstrings, which hamstrings do knee flexion and hip extension. And so what you're trying to do is remember when you're stretching as well, whatever the muscles do, you want to do the opposite for that. So like I said, hamstrings do knee flexion and hip extension. So you can see this athlete right here is now knee extended and hip flexed. And so with that, that's how we know we're going to stretch the hamstrings, because we're putting the range of motion through the opposite of what the concentric action of the muscle is. And so that's why you see, make sure the leg's locked down. You see that the leg right in front of the knee, or the hand right on the knee, to keep that everything stabilized. And so for right here, the athlete's just going to relax. And then from here, you can see then it's a passive pre-stretch of hamstring during hold, relax, PNF hamstring stretch. So you can see the partner is pushing while keeping the leg stabilized, pushing the leg, in that more as hip flex as much as possible. There's the pre-stretch. And then from there to a certain point to where the athlete can't really move the leg as much, then this is where the hold part is. So you'll tell the athlete, all right, resist my movement. And so the partner will then push the leg, and then the athlete will isometrically hold as long, or for the 6 seconds, or whatever time they recommend. They recommend the time here. They recommend it for 6 seconds. Well, you could go based upon the athlete, whatever they want to do. The athlete could hold a little bit longer. The point being, isometric hold for a certain amount of time. And then after that, then the partner is going to push the leg to a further range of motion than what the athlete was capable of doing on their own. You can see the increased range of motion during passive stretch of the hold, relax, PNF hamstring stretch. Okay, I wouldn't recommend doing a lot of reps of this, but you might do 2 or 3 reps just to kind of really help out as much as possible. Okay, so just to go through it again, for the hold relax technique, once you're set up, you've got everything stabilized, partner will push the leg to a point to where the athlete can't, the leg can't move any further. You're going to do that And then you're going to then tell the athlete, all right, resist me. So then you can see the partner's going to push the leg, not too hard, but just put a little bit of force, just a little bit of resistance on the leg. The athlete's going to isometrically hold for a certain amount of time. And after that, then the partner's going to push the leg, making sure it's fully stabilized to a further point than where the athlete was able to do before. Okay, so that's the hold relax technique. Then you got the contract relax, which is very similar, but a little bit different. So once again, do the passive pre-stretch of the hamstring during contract relax. So do the same thing as we just saw. You can see, once again, the leg on the ground is stabilized as much as possible, and the leg being stretched. The hands, same place. So at the knee, keeping the knee from bending at all, keeping everything nice and tight, and everything as stabilized as much as possible. So you're going to do the passive pre-stretch. But then on this one, instead of isometrically holding, the partner's going to try and concentrically resist. So you see concentric action of hip extensors during contract relax PNF stretch. So this one, they're going to forcefully with the hips try and resist the partner as much as possible. So you're not isometrically holding, you're actually going to put as much force into the partner as much as possible. And you're going to try and this one right here, so remember the hamstrings, so our leg is hip flexed right now. The hip is in flexion. So then you're going to activate the hamstrings because they do hip extension, and you're going to try and extend those hamstrings or those hips as much as possible. So there's the concentric action there. And then after that, for a certain amount of time, then you'll do just like on the last one we saw, then the partner's going to then push the leg into a further range of motion than where the athlete wants to start off at. It says hold relax with agonist contraction. So during the third phase, the passive stretch, concentric action of the agonist is used to increase the stretch force. So like I said, they're all very similar. This is the third one right here. They're all very similar. It's just the last part's the one that kind of usually is a little bit different. So here with the hold relax with agonist contraction, you can see passive stretch, hold relax with agonist contraction of PNF, the isometric action of the hamstring during the hold relax with agonist contraction. So this one's once again doing the isometric hold here instead of the concentric like we just saw. And then the last part right here, and you're going to the athlete's going to concentrically then see the quads do hip flexion. And so right here, they're going to concentrically contract the quads because they do hip, or the rectus femoris does the hip flexion. So as the partner is pushing the leg, the athlete's going to contract the quads as much as possible to try and get even further range of motion than if the partner's just doing it alone. It says the hold relax with agonist contraction is the most effective PNF stretch due to the facilitation via both reciprocal and autogenic inhibition. So common stretches, common PNF stretches with a partner: calves and ankles, chest, groin, hamstrings and hip extensors, quads and hip flexors, and the shoulders. So here's the calves. Everything would be the exact same as we just saw. We just used the hamstring because that's the most common one that athletes like to be stretched is the hamstrings. But here's the calves. Here's stretching the chest, the groin, quadriceps and hip flexors, shoulders, And that is it right there. Those are the most common ones. Really, with PNF stretching, use the big movements, the big joints are the ones that need this the most. And you can see right there that it was the shoulders and hips. Because if you're looking at the hamstrings, the quads, the groin, all that's surrounding the hips. So those are usually the ones where need to be stretched. And then also we saw the shoulders, the chest. That's also up in the shoulder, the glenohumeral joint. So it's usually only you're going to be doing PNF for the big, complex, multi movement joints like the shoulders and the hips. So as we see from this chapter, that a warm-up is important for competition or training. It improves strength, power, helps out with endurance via getting the metabolic processes ready to go, the cardiovascular system ready to go. So warm-up is essential to training and competition. You should never just get going cold. Okay, so we know now the warm-up should last 5 to 10 minutes or 10 to 20 minutes, should encompass some kind of aerobic base for a few minutes, followed by some kind of stretching, primarily dynamic, and then from there, sport-specific, the activity specific to what you're doing, some kind of movements mimicking that. I use Olympic weightlifting as an example all the time, so it'd be like cycling for a few minutes, some kind of dynamic warm-up, moving the legs, getting ready for training, and then on the platform performing the movements that you're training that day, cleans, jerks, snatches, so forth. Okay, so that's kind of an example of a warm-up there. Then we saw stretching. You have dynamic, which is preferred. That is active voluntary muscle contractions going through the movement. Static is a passive hold where you're holding you're passively stretching the muscle longer to where it needs to be. And you got ballistic, which should be steered away from. That's a bouncing type movement. So we should steer just to static and dynamic. Dynamic before activity, static after the activity. And then we also have PNF, so proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So remember with that one, you have the hold relax, where whatever you want to make sure you're doing this, and really for all stretching should be this way, is make sure the joints and everything stabilized. But we saw with the hold and relax where the partner will press the leg to a certain point, and then from there the athlete will then isometrically hold against the partner and for a certain amount of time, and then from there the partner will then push the leg past further than where the athlete could do by themselves. And then you got the contract relax, which is very similar for the first part. You got the passive hold. And then from there, instead of isometrically holding, the athlete will then concentrically press against the partner as hard as they possibly can for a certain amount of time. And then from there, then the partner will push the leg further than where it needs, than it once was able to go. And then the last one, you got the whole contract, but you're doing with agonist contraction. So that one where during that third phase, like where the partner is pushing the leg further than what the athlete could do with the agonist contraction, the partner is pushing the leg, but then the athlete is concentrically then moving the leg as well. Okay, so the partner's putting the leg into a further hip flexion for the example we saw. So the athlete's going to contract the hip flexors as much as they can, primarily the quads, contracting them as much as they can along with the partner. Therefore, you get the greatest range of motion increase right there. And that's what they say, that one, you get the greatest range of motion there. Okay, so I know I made comments about times. It's going to vary depending upon the athlete and partner. But for the sake of the test, for the sake of in here, make sure you know those times that they showed on the slides. Make sure you know that, the passive stretch 10 seconds, and then the isometric hold 6 seconds, and then the partner, then pushing the leg in further range of motion for 30 seconds. So know those times on those slides. Okay, for the exam, just for the sake of this class. Now, granted, working on athletes, if you're doing your own, might vary up on there, but for this class, know those times and to move forward for like the exam and moving and so forth. So to wrap up, just make sure you know the components of the warm up and stretching and why both of those are important and essential for training and competition.